Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Lots to cover today. So, jumping right in with our 2025 legislative wrap. This is a session within our education series that the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does most months of the year. And it's hosted by our education and advocacy team. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. You're basically going to learn all about what happened this year during leg session. So what we're going to cover today are legislative session, the key themes in the legislative makeup and leaders a bit. We're going to cover the legislative process refresher. We're not doing the full deep dive that we've done in the past, but you can find that information from last year's session if you want to get really deep on all this information. And then look at our legislative priorities and then other bills that came through. So I'm going to go ahead and hand off to Cathy Alderman, Chief Communications and Public Policy Officer, and she and Andrew West, who's our policy associate, will take it from here. So thanks.
Thanks, Alexis. And as we get started today, I would just want to do a huge shout out to the team at CCH, the Education Advocacy Team, who works to bring you all of this amazing content, but also does the work of the content and lobbies on the bills and puts together the reports. And so after this, you'll see our full legislative report, which you can read and print and share, though it is many pages long, because per usual, this was a pretty busy session. I also want to thank, and I can see that he's joined Danny McCarthy, who's our contract lobbyist, who really shepherds us through the legislative process every year, helps us out with our lobby day, and is our eyes and ears on the ground on the days that we can't be there. So next slide. So the legislative session began in January, ended in May. It is a 120-day session each year, and this year was no exception to that. Next slide. Many of you who may have joined us for our legislative preview know that both the House and the Senate were led by Democrats, though there was not the supermajority that we had seen in prior years. And because of that, we had some different dynamics this time around in session. We know that the governor of Colorado, Governor Polis, is very involved in legislative session, advances his own legislative agenda, and this year was no different. Though he came forward with several more veto threats, and still some of those are pending today on specific pieces of legislation. We also know with a big change at the federal level that there's a lot of uncertainty about whether Colorado's funding environment is going to have to be reevaluated and readjusted. The ongoing tensions around immigration issues, those who want to provide more protections, those who want to see more enforcement, really do continue to ignite at the Capitol, leading to some very long and contentious debates. And again, while we have Democratic majorities in both chambers, all Democrats are not alike. And so we do see a lot of just natural tension, natural conflict arise on particular issues, different ways of wanting to approach things. And we did all of this under the cover of a major budget year where there were major budget gaps. And that just led to a lot more deeper conversations about how we move forward. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we had a $1.2 billion shortfall in the budget. A lot of this is due because of rising costs in healthcare and education, some additional cuts to our general fund, and the constraints that we continuously face because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which allows state revenue only to grow as much as population growth. And so it gives us a really difficult environment to operate in when we're trying to account for a rising cost of things. We ended up with a $43.9 billion spending plan, and a lot of the cuts that we saw were not will not be felt as deeply as we had fully anticipated because they were more budget maneuvering in terms of sweeping some cash funds that had some funds that had been untouched, unspent in them, using interest to backfill to backfill the general fund gaps, and some other maneuvers. But what that means is that we go into this year again with another very likely difficult budget year, in which case there may not be any place other than to actually cut programs. Next slide. So I think I hand this over to my colleague Andrew West, and he and I are going to be tag teaming this tonight, so you won't always just hear one of our voices. We're not joined tonight by our advocacy program director Aubrey Wild, who many of you are used to hearing from, because she is on family leave after she and her partner gave birth to two beautiful twin baby girls over the weekend. So take it away, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for getting us started. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I'm Andrew West again. I'm Policy Associate at the Coalition for the Homeless, and I work with Aubrey and Kathy on our policy team. As Kathy mentioned, we're very lucky to have the chance to influence policy throughout every step of the legislative process. And this year, like past years, we stayed pretty busy. We had the opportunity to weigh in on a lot of bills. In total, there were 657 bills introduced, and we were tracking about 198 of those. That doesn't include the resolutions that made their way. That's mostly this focuses on just the bills. So we tracked about 30% of the bills that moved their way through the legislature. We engaged on 43 bills. That might look like negotiating amendments, actually drafting the bill, offering testimony. And of those 43, 38 of those achieved our desired outcome. So that means that a bill, it was one that we supported and it passed, or it was a bill that we opposed and it failed. It also includes a bill that we might have monitored or more passively supported and either passed or failed. And of course, we couldn't do all this work without the strong support of both our internal CCH staff and our strong network of supporters. Throughout the session, we will send action alerts out for specific bills, sometimes calling for testimony, sometimes calling for people to write a letter or make calls to their legislators. And about 31,000 people in our CCH network received an action alert this year. Which is a fantastic number and really helps drive a lot of engagement and conversation at the Capitol around some of our priorities. I'll talk about this a bit more on the next slide, but we had about 60 attendees at our CCH Lobby Day. And this year we offered testimony 34 times on 22 bills. So sometimes there were repeats on that, but we focused on 22 bills for testimony. Our lobby day, as usual, was a blast. It is one of my favorite days of the year. It was March 4th this year, and we had both CCH staff members and members of our advocacy network come down to the Capitol and focus on three of our big priority bills this year. A lot of you on the call will be probably familiar with a few of these bills, but we'll give a more in-depth overview in the next couple of slides here. We were able to have conversations with at least 16 legislators, and we were very lucky to have Representative Rudenell come speak to us, and we're also honored by Representative Junie Joseph, who had a very, very nice honor for the coalition on the House floor. As you can see in that middle photo there were a few staff members that got to actually go on the floor to accept that award and be recognized, which was very cool. All right, thank you. Next slide. And then I'll give a bit of an overview of the legislative process here. Again, I won't dive into this as deeply as we do in some of our other sessions, but just to give you a bit of background as we're talking about these bills, so you have a sense of more specifically what we're talking about. A lot of the work that is done on these bills takes place outside of the session. I think it's important to note all the work that goes into bills in the summer, in the fall. So we're already doing some work trying to identify some bill concepts and ideas that we might be focusing on next year. But this will just look at what happens once session starts. Of course, once a bill is introduced, it is given a formal bill number and title, and then is assigned to its relevant committee. So when we talk about committee hearings throughout, that is a smaller group of legislators, usually 5 to 13, who have a specific issue area of focus, and they come together to have a lot of that in-depth discussion and also take public testimony on a bill. So those committee hearings meet before referring a bill to the larger body where there's 2 chances at a vote. If a bill passes out of the first chamber. So say a bill is a House bill, you'll hear us talking about House bill, also referenced as HB, and then Senate bills referenced as SB. They'll begin in their chamber of origin, which is either the House or Senate, depending on where it starts. And then this process here that you see on the slide before you is all after it passes the first committee. Or I'm sorry, after it passes the first chamber. There are two ways that it can pass. It can either pass unamended, so say it's a House bill, it can pass that without amendments, and then we'll go to the Senate. If there are amendments in that second chamber, it has to go back to the chamber of origin for them to accept the amendments. There's opportunity for them to agree on the amendments, and then it either goes to the governor for signature or to a vote of the people to become law. And in the case that they are in disagreement about the amendments, there is a conference committee where a few members get together and really hammer out and negotiate the bill to make sure that they have something that is feasible and implementable. If at any point in the process a bill doesn't get enough votes to make it to the next step, it is considered dead and is lost. A bill can also be postponed indefinitely or PI'd, and that means that members vote in committee to postpone the bill on their own. So they take a formal vote to kill the bill and end that legislative effort. So that's a bit of background. So hopefully you have a bit more context as we're talking through some of these bills.
Thanks,
And
Andrew.
Cathy?
As in most years, we set our priorities usually in the fall, early winter, before session begins. But our priorities don't change that much. They're usually in these big four buckets of affordable housing, homelessness, health, and economic justice. And some years we weigh in a little bit more heavily on things that impact the criminal legal system. And you'll see that we did some of that this year, but not as a out of the gate priority. But essentially, we're trying to increase resources and funding for affordable housing, as well as protecting people who are in housing so they don't fall into the cycle of homelessness, supporting the homelessness response system, including homelessness prevention and resolution, increasing opportunities for access to health care, including mental behavioral health and substance use treatment, and making sure that folks get access to the benefits and resources they need to thrive. Next slide. And so this year in the homelessness bucket, we were really proud to run a proactive piece of legislation, House Bill 1032, which was improving infrastructure to reduce homelessness. We've seen a huge increase in the rise of homelessness across the state. We've seen some new investments, but what we haven't seen is a statewide strategy. And so what this bill would have done, had it passed, in the next slide, is it would have reestablished an interagency council on homelessness at the administrative level or the executive level, requiring many agencies involved in homelessness resolution and prevention to come together and work on a strategy. That agency would have had an advisory council made up of stakeholders and folks in the field, including those with lived experience, to, over the next year, really devise a statewide strategy which could help to identify the policies and resources needed to achieve that strategy. The second thing it would have done is allow counties and municipalities to form regional homeless response authorities, so that they could kind of come together on some agreements, intergovernmental agreements, and they would have the ability to raise revenue for the implementation of a homelessness plan, resolution and prevention plan in their region. And the third thing is the bill would have allowed document fees to be used for affordable housing. These are fees that are already collected at the local government level. And this provision would have just allowed local governments to, should they so choose, move some part of that fee into an affordable housing fund if they already have one in existence, or to spend to address affordable housing issues, especially as it relates to the increase in homelessness. Unfortunately, this bill did die on the calendar, meaning that it just didn't have enough time to get through because it did have a bit of a fiscal note. And as I mentioned previously, we had a really tough budget year. So we'll be working on this in the interim and hopefully bringing something back next session. The second bill that we worked on was to adjust the necessary document program. This was Senate Bill 08. This program provides identification documents such as driver's licenses and state ID cards to marginalized populations. Populations have a difficult time existing without these documents and often have barriers in getting access to these documents, including people experiencing homelessness. The program has been around since 2006, and but it really falls short of the need, and it doesn't have quite the funding that it needs, nor does it have really easy access to getting these vouchers for documents. Next slide. So this bill would have made some adjustments, including reducing the need to have an actual physical paper voucher to take when applying for these documents, making sure that folks could use these vouchers at the point of service and not have to go to multiple locations to get the documents and then go get their their voucher and their IDs, allowing people to self-attest to their eligibility to the program, and hopefully increasing overall funding. And unfortunately, we did need to cut the funding and just make some of these administrative and technical changes this year, but we fully anticipate that we will be back before the legislature in a more robust funding year so that we can request the funds that the program needs to fully operate. This bill did pass both houses and was recently signed by the governor, and so we consider that a big win. Next slide. And I'm going to let Andrew go ahead and talk through our third priority bill, which he led in partnership with some of our organizational partners.
Thank you, Cathy. Yeah, this last bill we were working on was House Bill 1168, Housing Protections for Victim Survivors. And this is one that we worked on with Representatives Mandy Lindsay and Cecilia Espinosa, as well as Senator Weissman, who have been really great champions on a lot of the bills that we worked on this year. I also want to give a shout out to our partners at Colorado Poverty Law Project and the Women's Foundation, as well as a bunch of organizations who were really involved with drafting this bill, testifying, highlighting it at their own lobby days. But this is a bill that seeks to both expand on current protections and create some new ones specific to victim survivors of domestic violence and abuse. We know that that is one of the main causes of housing instability and homelessness throughout our state. And we, in conversations with some folks at the Colorado Poverty Law Project, heard that a lot of their clients had difficulty accessing some of the legal protections that were already in law. Notably, there was a bill in 2017 that allows a victim survivor to break their lease and only be on the hook for 1 month's rent. But in reality, we hear that a lot of landlords were routinely and oftentimes knowingly going after 6 months' rent, 9 months' rent, or even the remainder of rent owed under the lease. So seeking to have better enforcement of that, as well as creating some new method, some more accessible ways to exercise these legal protections. So next slide, please. The three main areas that this bill focused on, although it touched on a lot of different things, it ended up being an almost 30-page bill. So we're able to accomplish a lot. But the main three things are housing stability, so making sure that people can remain housed and avoid evictions and entering the cycle of homelessness. The second is due process and access to justice. So a lot of reforms in court procedures, how a victim survivor actually access these protections, and then safety concerns. So making sure that people who have experienced these types of violence are safe from harm and address some of those immediate physical and other types of safety concerns. Next slide, please. The bill was pretty wonky. It touches on a lot of different things, but I'll give a few of the main ones. I already touched on the lease break provision and better enforcement of that law. It also provides more time to move after an eviction and protects an investment in the security deposit for a victim survivor when damages to the unit were caused by an abusive party. So we want to be very clear that if there was damage caused to a unit that was not due to anyone's, that was due to the abusive party, that the victim survivor is not on the hook for that part of the security deposit. In the area around court payments, we also, not court payments, the court procedure, there is an option for a rent repayment plan in the case of where domestic violence is tied to non-payment of rent. So it allows a tenant to actually catch up on some of that back rent owed and make sure that a landlord is made whole and they are able to maintain their housing. It also aligns the different types of violence in the law with between the landlord-tenant law and eviction law to make sure that those protections are offered across the board. There's expanded access to verification of how you demonstrate your status, some reforms around court protections and timelines. And then that last bucket, safety from harm, includes some provisions around confidentiality and safety adjustments to the unit that are reasonable and making sure that a landlord allows those. So we're very fortunate that this bill passed out of both chambers and was actually signed into law by the governor last week. So this is going to be pretty impactful for some of our most vulnerable people throughout the state, and we're really excited to see this one become law. And then, Cathy, I'll toss it back to you to give a quick overview of our positions, and then we'll talk a bit more about some of the other bills that weren't one of our main three, but nonetheless we engaged on throughout the year.
Yes, and we'll go through these pretty quickly because, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a pretty thorough report so you can read all about it. But we just want to hit some highlights to let folks know that what we were working on. And what you'll see as we go through these is that some bills we just monitor. We really just watch them through the process, make sure that nothing crazy happens to them, and then evaluate their potential impact to us upon implementation. There are other bills that we support. We just talked about three of those. Generally, when we support a bill, it can range from signing on to a letter in support to contacting legislators to being the driver behind the bill. There's obviously bills that we oppose that we know will be harmful for our community and just simply aren't good policy. And then there are a lot of bills that we could be in multiple places on the bill, and we're working to amend. And that oftentimes means, offering actual legislative language, making suggestions for how the bill could be better or how to mitigate the potential harm that the bill might have if it looks like it's going to pass. Next slide. So on the housing side, we took several positions on some bills, including House Bill 1019, which really allows the Division of Housing a clearer path forward to administering grant programs through partnerships. And this was a bill that passed very early on in session, not a lot of controversy. That was great. The governor signed it pretty quickly. We also supported some accessibility standards and building codes to increase access to housing for folks living with disabilities. There was an expansion of the limitations on local anti-growth land use policies provision that we passed a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, just further defining what counts as an anti-growth land use policy. We actually had a mixed position on the House Bill 1169, the YIGBY bill, because we wanted to see more affordability requirements in that bill, and we did work with the sponsors. We actually got to a place of being neutral on the bill, but unfortunately, it did not pass. Next slide. We did also work on Senate Bill 6, which allows for investment of authority of the state treasurer to develop affordable housing. Again, we really wanted to see some affordability protections to make sure that any housing that benefits from the use of a public resource or public funding ensures some affordability back to the community. There was a early bill introduced called Reducing the Cost of Housing, which would have really decimated our housing budget by making it applicable to or making it available to locations based on populations. And it was a really ill thought out bill. We opposed that early on. Senate Bill 167 could have been an interesting housing bill and originally had some really strong housing funding provisions that may have ended up in supporting some permanent supportive housing opportunities, but unfortunately those provisions were taken out of the bill, and so now there is some housing components based on use of school finance funds for employees of the public school system, something that we continue to monitor, but we didn't necessarily need to engage in further after those other provisions were taken out. And then I think I'm going to toss it back over to Andrew to talk through the renters protections bills that we worked on.
Thank you, Cathy. Yeah, this was an area that had a lot of different bills. There were some good, some bad. you'll see it's really a mixed bag on these renter protections. The first one, no pricing coordination between landlords, would prohibit a landlord from coordinating to raise, lower, change, or manipulate the price of rent. And this is a bill that came back from last year. This is a bill that failed in 2024 and returned this year, and really hopes to limit the cost of housing when it's artificially inflated by rent algorithms that some of the largest corporate landlords use. We supported this in a bit of a more passive way, but currently there is a veto threat from the governor. The last I heard is that it is still under veto threat. So if this is something that you're interested in, there's still opportunity to advocate for the actual passage and signature of this bill. The next bill, House Bill 25-1092, rent increases by landlord to tenant, would have really emboldened landlords to raise rent costs dramatically. This is one that we opposed, and I testified in opposition in its first committee of reference, but it would have tied the definition of a reasonable rent increase to fair market rent. It doesn't specify exactly what that relationship to fair market rent is, and we are concerned that this would encourage landlords to raise rent in some cases. I already touched on 1168 in a previous slide. That is one that we supported and passed. And then another one that we had to oppose was House Bill 1196, landlord procedures for removal of tenants. And this would have rolled back some of the protections that we passed in a 2021 law. That was Senate Bill 21-173, that prevents evictions based on late fees. So this bill would have removed that provision and allowed a landlord to evict a tenant for late fees or the non-payment of those late fees. And that is also one that we were able to have killed in its first committee. The next bill, 1207, pet ownership, residential housing structures. This also was a bill that was from last year, I believe, and continued a multi-year debate around how pets are allowed in state-funded family housing, multifamily housing. And our position was that one-size-fits-all approach of really mandating pets fails to adequately account for different types of variations in property, different tenant needs, and different types of pets. And fortunately, we were able to work with the sponsors, and they were flexible and receptive to some amendments that brought CCH to a neutral position. And this bill did pass. House Bill 1236, residential tenant screening reports, is also a cleanup bill from a bill that we worked on in 2023. That was House Bill 1099 in 2023, that allows a tenant to use a tenant screening report, which serves as a sort of background check rather than having to get a background check every time you apply for a new housing unit. So obviously, we hope that this would both save tenants costs, hopefully expedite the rental application process, allow more people to access housing, and exit the cycle of homelessness. This cleaned up that bill, making sure that those tenant screening reports can be used effectively and efficiently, and we were glad to see that pass. The next one, House Bill 1240, protections for tenants with housing subsidies, is one we worked on with the Poverty Law Project and Enterprise Community Partners to actually draft. It establishes a few key protections for tenants with a housing subsidy. So you might be thinking of a housing choice voucher is one of the subsidies that would be impacted under this bill. The first thing it does is that it increases penalties and enforcement for violation of source of income discrimination law. So if a landlord refuses to rent to a tenant who has a voucher, that's currently already illegal, but this bill increases some of those penalties to hopefully encourage better compliance. It also codifies a provision from the Federal CARES Act that requires 30 days notice before eviction for tenants who do have that housing subsidy. It requires a landlord to reasonably comply with applications for emergency rental assistance. We know emergency rental assistance has been very effective in allowing tenants to stay housed, but it can be difficult to use if you're not getting the documents or not getting the documents in time for the application. So this would have cleaned that up and encouraged compliance there. And then the last thing was a sort of wonky provision that would have that clarifies that tenants are entitled to compensation when their unit is uninhabitable, regardless of whether they have a subsidy or not. And then the final bill, could we just go back one slide here? we've got a lot in this renters protections bucket. But the last bill, tenant and landlord law enforcement, clarifies that the Colorado Attorney General's office and other local government bodies have power to enforce different landlord-tenant laws. So some of the laws that we're talking about here actually fall under the scope of the Senate Bill 20. We testified in support of those provisions and also were involved in advocating for language around the second part of the bill, which creates a receivership mechanism that allows a local government to bring a property that's fallen really out of habitability standards into disrepair back up to a reasonable place where a tenant can live there. We worked on some negotiations ensuring that this is only used in cases where situations become really dire and a landlord has not taken steps in the right direction to remedy that. And next slide here. So obviously all the bills that we've talked about today in some way relate to homelessness, but there were a few this year that focused really specifically on people experiencing homelessness. The first Cathy already talked about, that was House Bill 1032, which we took a lead on, which unfortunately did not pass this year. And then there were two bills that we were pretty concerned about and we testified in opposition in its committee of reference. The first one would have created, prohibiting squatting, would have created a new criminal penalty for squatting. And our argument was that this bill is really unnecessary and in some ways duplicative because a landlord already has remedies to evict a tenant who is no longer paying rent or is occupying a property that they aren't legally allowed to be. And there are also a wide range of trespassing laws in the first, second, and third degree with pretty heavy penalties in the case that someone is unlawfully occupying a property. So we said that this is unnecessary. There are already remedies to do this. And we are concerned that this would be specifically used to target people experiencing homelessness and in some cases circumvent the required eviction process. Fortunately, members of the first committee were receptive to these concerns and postponed the bill indefinitely. 1142, the increased criminal penalty for failure to exit premises, had the same fate and was killed in its first committee. And this would have increased the penalty from a misdemeanor to a felony in the case that someone refuses to leave a premises when they're asked by an officer. And we were also concerned that there would be differing enforcement based on who the person is, what they're doing. And we were concerned that this would be used to target in many ways people who are experiencing homelessness and might be, in a public space and be trying to stay dry, stay warm, and that it would create an increased threat of penalty and in many cases escalate these situations rather than actually resolving the situation. So this is one that we opposed and also failed. And then another bucket that we were pretty involved with this year around substance use disorder and harm reduction. There were only two bills in this year. I think we've seen more in past years, but one that we have been involved in many years, another multi-year conversation, was around Senate Bill 44, synthetic opiate criminal penalty, that would have increased the level of penalty to a level 1 drug felony to manufacture, dispense, sell, distribute, or even possess any material with any amount of fentanyl, regardless of the amount, regardless of whether the person was aware that the material even contained fentanyl. And I want to give a shout out to a lot of our partners in the Right Response Coalition who came together in a really solid, unified way with a strong voice to oppose this bill. Even though the bill did die in its first committee, we know that this is something that we're going to continue to see in future years, and we are aware of a ballot measure that has been filed that would go to the voters in 2026 and ask them to approve this. So we'll be involved in future legislative efforts to push back against this further criminalization of drug use and ballot measures as well as we see those. And then Senate Bill 66, we weren't as involved with, but this would have placed certain restrictions on how the state is able to contract with opiate antagonist providers. And we were concerned that this would have threatened naloxone access and stability throughout the state. So we were able to push back, and that bill was fortunately postponed indefinitely as well. All right, and that's a lot from me. I'm going to toss it back to Cathy to talk about some healthcare and public health bills.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice summary. So a couple of the bills that we supported this year were specific to federally qualified health centers, of which Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does operate as a federally qualified health center through and with our partners at the Colorado Community Health Network, of which we're a member. We've been looking for ways to really shore up the safety net of healthcare providers, which are the FQHCs and community health centers. And so we worked initially on House Bill 1174, or sorry, 1278 to support federally qualified health centers with one funding mechanism. And then it's on the next slide, but you don't have to move to the next slide. We ended up seeing Senate Bill 290, which allowed for stabilization payments for safety net providers. And these two bills were being negotiated kind of throughout the session, and we ended up with Senate Bill 290 passing, which will provide some really critical funding and access to gap financing essentially for health centers, especially as we looked towards potential federal cuts. And this is really critical. We haven't really been able to achieve a lot of growth in the FQHC provision of services and market. And so this is one way I think that the Colorado General Assembly really stepped up and recognized the importance of providing these healthcare services, particularly to low-income patients and clients. We also worked on a bill that House Bill 1174, which would kind of sought to limit the rate at which health insurers may reimburse for the provision of certain healthcare services, and that bill did fail. We worked on House Bill 1297, which would have established a new enterprise for the distribution of certain funding. And again, this was just not necessarily the year for it, but it would have provided some additional support for some of the programs that help marginalized communities who don't otherwise have access to healthcare. And then we supported, as we have in the past, Senate Bill 45, which would have done a payment analysis system, really in that charge towards what would it look like to have a single-payer healthcare and universal access healthcare system in Colorado. Next slide. We also worked on prohibiting restrictions on 340B drugs. 340B drugs it's a pharmacy benefit that federally qualified health centers use in order to deliver low-cost prescription drugs to patients, and this would have prohibited restrictions on where those drugs could be acquired and allowing them to be required at all pharmacies. We also, as we have in the past, continued to support reimbursement for community health workers. And as I mentioned, the stabilization payments for safety net providers, which largely impact federally qualified health centers and community behavioral health system centers. Next slide. Can't remember, Andrew, am I kicking it back over to you for this last one?
Yes, back
Great.
to me. One of the larger buckets that we worked on this year was economic justice. This does tend to encompass a lot of different bill concepts. But there were a lot of bills brought forward this year related to economic justice. The first one, House Bill 1010, was one that we monitored and kept an eye on throughout the session. This defines price gouging as an increase of 10% or more over the average price of a good in the last 90 days, and adds the practice of price gouging as a violation of consumer protection law. Again, we weren't super involved with this one, but this did pass this year. The next bill, House Bill 1071, distribution of state money, would have modified the way that the state allocates certain funds to local governments, and would have potentially had a negative impact on programs and the overall viability of the state budget. We pushed back on this in a bit more of a passive way, but this bill did die in its first committee. House Bill 1090, protections against deceptive pricing practices. This was also referred to as the junk fees bill, as it's nicknamed throughout the year. We supported this throughout the session, and Aubrey Wild testified on the bill in both chambers. And this bill expands transparency around the cost of goods and services and restricts junk fees without disclosure. So it doesn't prohibit those fees, but just seeks to have a better sense of clarity around what consumers are being charged and what for. And our main focus area of excitement around the bill was around some provisions aimed at transparency and fairness in housing to protect tenants, perhaps unsurprisingly. We know that many tenants are on the verge of homelessness and can be cost burdened, and that a lot of these inflated fees and deceptive pricing practices can really make it hard to plan as a tenant. And if you're having fees tacked on and extra charges that you don't know, that can really be a cause of instability for many. We also wanted to make sure that things like pest control that are included are considered part of a landlord's basic responsibility to maintain and upkeep the property rather than an additional fee that they're charging a tenant. This bill did pass and will allow tenants to make more informed decisions and have a better have more information as they're going about that process. This passed and was signed into law by the governor just a couple of weeks ago. House Bill 1194, Protections for Victims of Economic Abuse, would have provided some protections and remedies for victims of economic abuse or coerced debt. And this was related in some ways to the bill we worked on, 1168, trying to better establish that financial instability, how that relates to housing and how that relates to domestic violence and abuse. Unfortunately, this bill did not pass. There was a large fiscal note or cost associated with the bill, which caused some difficulties early on. So although we supported this one, we were bummed to see that it did not make it through. Next slide, thank you. House Bill 1279, State Level Data for Colorado Works Program. This is Colorado's version of the TANF program, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And what this bill does is allow the state to collect some better data. So we have a better ability to plan and really track the program for success and other outcomes. We testified in a support position, I believe, in the House committee, and we're really glad to see that this one passed. We already covered Senate Bill 8, the Necessary Documents Program, but this was one of our main priorities in the Economic Justice Bill, that bucket this year. And then Senate Bill 169, this was led by the Colorado Blueprint to End Hunger, and it would requires the Department of Human Services to implement a meals program for SNAP, or the formerly known as the food stamps program, so people can use those at restaurants. We know that people who are experiencing homelessness often don't have ways to cook or store food, refrigerate food, so access to hot and nutritious meals is really important. This bill did pass and will hopefully expand access to food justice, and we're really excited about that. And then the last bill in this economic justice bucket was led by the Colorado Fiscal Institute and a lot of partners that would evaluate the impact of Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights that Cathy talked about earlier when we discussed the budget. That in many ways makes it difficult for legislators to pass a state budget that's healthy, that's sustainable. A lot of the mechanisms that were used to balance the budget this year are in some ways a result of Tabor and just what they're able to do with the budget. The bill would have filed a lawsuit on behalf of the General Assembly to evaluate the constitutionality of Tabor and have a clear legal evaluation of whether that is constitutional or not. That one, unfortunately, after it passed its first committee, it was not scheduled for a larger debate with the entire House chamber. So this is something that we anticipate will continue to be a hot button issue and come back in future years. And then criminal legal reform. This was another bucket where we were very engaged this year. And a lot of this work was with our partners at the Colorado Freedom Fund. So I want to give them a special shout out. We know that criminal legal reform is very important to resolving homelessness in many cases. And a few of these bills pretty directly impact a lot of the folks that we serve. The first one, 1015, makes a small clarifying change to bond statute law and ensures that existing law that people can post bail online is followed. So that's small clarifying changes to conform with existing law, and we are excited to see that one pass. The next bill, House Bill 25-1147, was a bill that addressed fairness and transparency in municipal courts. Unfortunately, municipal courts and state courts have a lot of discrepancies between the two in terms of sentencing, so how long people actually get their sentence for. We know that there are a lot of charges in state courts that are only a 10-day sentence, and we've heard instances where people serve almost a year in a municipal court. So making sure that municipal court and state courts are in alignment in both the sentencing as well as access to legal representation, making sure that people have legal counsel, and basic transparency around public access to court hearings so that people are actually able to see and engage in that process. This bill had a lot of strong bipartisan support, but was unfortunately vetoed by the governor just a couple of weeks ago. So we're really disappointed to see that was vetoed, and hopefully can work on future efforts to bring this bill forward. House Bill 1276, court actions related to failure to appear in court, would have further criminalized poverty and allowed unhoused individuals to be jailed pre-trial on cash bonds when they have missed court appearances. We pushed back on this and really tried to give some insight as to why people miss court, providing constant text that people are not thumbing their noses at the court. That was a lot of the narrative that we heard in the committee, that people are doing it to thumb their noses at the court. And we highlighted that, people are going through a lot of different things and in many ways are trying to survive on the day-to-day. And that these are really related to poverty and experiences of homelessness. Fortunately, the sponsors were very receptive. We had a lot of strong testimony, and the sponsors backed off a little bit and actually moved to postpone the bill indefinitely, which we were really excited to see. I think sometimes there can be a lot of preconceived notions and people have their mindset before entering a committee hearing, and it's always really encouraging to see minds changed based on witness testimony and lived experience that's shared in the committee hearing room. And then the last bill in this bucket, Senate Bill 62, prevents a municipal court from establishing new charges on the basis of failure to appear. So if you're missing a court date, it prohibits a jail sentence for that and any new charges just for that failure to appear. Again, we know that a lot of these really minor infractions are related to experiences of homelessness, and stacking on failure to appear can lead to long jail sentences and make it overall way more difficult to actually regain stability and exit the cycle of homelessness. There was some threat of a veto. We were able to write a letter and do some advocacy, and fortunately the governor did sign this one into law a couple of weeks ago. And then our actually last bucket, miscellaneous. These are just bills that don't easily fall into any of the categories that we've discussed so far. The first, 1166, efforts to reduce food waste, directs the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or CDPHE, to include food waste reduction as a priority and an element of some of their programs, while also encouraging donations from food establishments to different types of providers. And we were excited that this bill would increase food access and is a pretty reasonable common sense bill. So this was one that we supported and we were glad to see pass. And then last, but certainly not least, was the Colorado Voting Rights Act, led by our friends at Colorado Common Cause and folks at the Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. This bill builds on a lot of the protections detailed in the Federal Voting Rights Act, which has over time seen some decisions that have weakened the bill in the Supreme Court, and we know that the Federal Voting Rights Act is under threat with this, with some changes in the new administration. The Colorado Voting Rights Act will reduce barriers to voter participation, guaranteeing legal protections for voters of color, voters who are in the criminal legal system. So Colorado actually allows people who are incarcerated to vote as long as you're not currently serving a felony sentence, and also creates protections for voters who are LGBTQ+. It also provides some provisions around language access, making sure that people who speak a language other than English, there's a lot of Spanish speakers throughout the state, that they are able to vote, and increases access for voters with disabilities as well. So this is one that we were engaged in and really excited to support, and has fortunately been signed by the governor. So this is now law. And we've given some shout outs to partners throughout, but I want to take a second and really give a huge shout out to these organizations and all the others that we worked on this with worked on bills with this legislative session. We really rely on our partners to flag bill concepts as they're coming along. A lot of the times, we're having meetings at the Capitol or just bumping into partners. And that's where we can get a heads up on either good bills that are coming that need support or bills that we might want to push back on. So we've had a lot of great support from our partners this year, and we really appreciate you all. And Cathy, I'll toss it back to you to give a quick overview of what we're going to be on the lookout for in the summer and looking towards next session.
Thanks, Andrew. And I want to echo Andrew's thanks to all of our partners. We couldn't do it without strong advocacy partners in this space. We couldn't do it without supporters like you who've joined us on this call and answer our emails and our calls to action. And so just really critical to have the community support that we have. And we think that that's what makes us be able to achieve 88% success rates with our legislative efforts. So what's next? What's on the horizon? What are we considering for next year? I will say there is a possibility of the governor needing to call a special session, especially if we see some of the major cuts that are being proposed at the federal level. That will have significant impacts on our state programs. In Colorado, because of Tabor, we don't have the ability to backfill any of these huge cuts that might be coming down, and so we would have to go back to the budget and find some places to make up these dollars. We also know that there have been some discussions that have taken place kind of publicly about a bill related to AI that might also warrant a special session. And so how that might be called is still up in the air, but we should know more late this summer. We also kind of don't know exactly, how and when everything that we've been supporting will be implemented and how we need to be involved in implementation. In some instances, that requires kind of standing alongside agencies as they write rules for implementation. And other ways, it just means making sure that there is outreach and education on these particular bills so that people are aware of them and know that they have to comply. And then we're working already on what we're anticipating for our 2026 legislative agenda. Again, I think our priorities won't change in terms of those big buckets, but the specific initiatives that we'll pursue might. We know that there'll be at least 2 in the homelessness bucket that will include some kind of revisit of House Bill 1032, improving infrastructure to reduce homelessness. We will be revisiting that and hopefully working with other partners to bring something forward on that bill. And we will also be working to reauthorize the homeless contribution tax credit, which is a bill that we worked on 4 years ago and had a 4-year sunset date. And so here we are already upon it. And that provides tremendous support for homeless service providers across the state through the provision of a tax credit to donors who give to those programs. We are also working with the Colorado Nonprofit Association on a potential fix to some weird ways in which financial institutions require nonprofits to receive funds, and so more to come on that, but something that we are considering. And then, frankly, we'll have to be doing a lot of work in response to what is happening at the federal level, whether that's cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, which are huge benefits that people experiencing homelessness and a lot of mid to low income households access. Just for their healthcare and nutrition needs. But we're also anticipating that late this summer or early fall, we'll start to understand what impacts this will have on the HUD budget and whether that will impact housing vouchers, homeless response funding programs, the ability of states to develop housing, maintain housing. So we know that there's a lot more to come there, and we'll need to respond to all of those things. And I think that wraps us up. But of course, we want to make sure we leave some time for questions. I know Alexis has been monitoring our Q&A and has received a couple of questions, so we're happy to dive in. Please, if you have questions, do put them in the Q&A, and maybe we'll let you go a little early this evening if we don't have that much more to say.
Thanks, Kathy. One that came up in the chat was from Jade that was asking for a little more detail about deceptive pricing. It says, would deceptive pricing include general discrimination, pricing strategies? So could you talk a little bit more about how the deceptive pricing works?
I can start, and then Andrew, maybe you, since you worked on this, but I'm not sure that it's going to get to claims of general discrimination pricing, so potentially charging certain groups of people separate prices for specific services. This was really intended to address kind of junk fees, so what we refer to as kind of like hidden fees. So making sure that people don't sign a lease that says they're going to be paying $1,400 a month, and then when the rent comes due, it's $1,600 because they realize that they're paying for trash collection fees and lobby maintenance fees and grounds fees, all of which could have been disclosed prior to signing the lease. I don't know if Andrew, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great overview. I think the provision that we were mainly focused on, and our colleague Aubrey Weil did a lot of the work on this bill, um, was around tenants and junk fees and housing. But the bill also, like Kathy said, prohibits um, misrepresentation of costs, along with a requirement that you have to disclose the total price of a good, and show pretty clearly and conspicuously what those fees are, what you're being charged for, how much those are, and the schedule of those as well. So I hope that answers your question, but um, that's the main thrust of the bill.
Thanks, Andrew. Um, Kathy, we had a question about, and keeping in mind that we are being recorded, we had a question about the sort of, you're talking about a Democratic majority and that we have a Democratic governor, and then we saw a good number of vetoes, or we're talking about a potential veto on one of the bills right now. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that democratic arc that we have of like a pretty big difference between people, and the difference with maybe the supermajority previously and then this year's majority and how that maybe impacted this year's session?
Sure. I mean, as I said, no two Democrats are absolutely alike, and people have different sets of priorities. In Colorado, we do have a pretty pro-business swath of Democrats serving in the legislature, and that does lead to a different kind of balance in how we approach things. And while we may come to the legislature and say this is frankly something we should do because it's good for people, we often hear, yes, but what will the impact on business be? And we hear that coming from the governor's office as well. And so I will say that Colorado tends to moderate a bit on even some of the priority issues that I think the community of Democrats might like to see a little more progressive and liberal policies in places. I also do think, though, there is really good camaraderie among the members of the General Assembly. Like they do listen to each other. They do sit down and really try to work things out. We see that with a lot of the pieces of legislation that we seek to amend. We tell people all the time, we're not coming in to amend your bill because we don't think it's good policy. We would just like to make it better policy and make sure that it doesn't increase harm in certain spaces. In terms of the supermajority, it really just took away the easy override of the governor's veto. And so you see this dynamic playing out where the governor sometimes early on in the process will say, if you pass this bill in a certain way, I'm going to veto it. And so you better work on it and make sure you get something to my desk that I can sign. And when you have the override, it's just a different strategy because you're able to, in the background, say, well, how much of these changes are we willing to make, or are we willing to go to bat for this policy and do it in the face of a potential veto because we have that override ability. And without that override ability, obviously, the negotiations just changed dramatically. And so we do see, and we are seeing, some vetoes of, I think, what the community would say were very good policies, but just things that the governor thought might have some unintended consequences and that he couldn't get behind this year. And usually what that means is that it's not back to the drawing board. It's usually back to what passed and how can we tame it.
Thank you. You did at the end talk a little bit about sort of what's happening federally. And for anybody who's on here, who's on our email list, who have been getting our weekly action alerts. And this time of year, we're really moving into out of session, for Colorado local things to do and more how do we respond to what's happening at the federal level. So, in terms of where the sort of big bill is that has the potential to really implicate Medicaid. Medicaid and of course other items as well. Can you talk a little bit about where we are with that and then perhaps what folks who are here can do to help support people experiencing homelessness?
Sure. So what we saw in the bill that passed the House last Thursday is a huge spending and tax bill, essentially that will extend the tax cuts that were provided under the first Trump administration and are set to expire. These tax cuts will largely benefit households of much higher incomes and actually might even negatively impact households at lower incomes. The bill also repeals some Biden era extend tax cuts for energy efficiency and green energy requirements. But the worst thing that this bill does, and what you've been hearing us, if you've been getting our emails screaming about, is it dramatically remakes the Medicaid program. And it does so in a way that will really harm individuals, and particularly individuals who are experiencing homelessness and are using Medicaid for health insurance and otherwise would not have access to healthcare services. It does this by implementing work requirements, meaning that somebody would have to certify that they are working 80 hours a month in order to qualify for Medicaid. Um, it also requires more frequent recertifications. So just having to go through the eligibility process time and time again, sometimes multiple times a year, which really just means that people are going to be left without Medicaid. And it makes some other kind of structural changes to the program that are really harmful in terms of how we think about Medicaid administration in Colorado, including prohibiting new provider taxes. Provider taxes are something that Colorado uses frequently to fund critical support services. The hospital provider fee is largely how we were able to expand state Medicaid programs in Colorado. Colorado was an expansion state, and it meant that more people were getting access to healthcare, and in the long run, that is so much better because then you have fewer people using emergency rooms and emergency services and making poor decisions about how to spend their very limited dollars. So we have a lot of concerns. It also really rolls back significantly the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which is how most people, especially young kids, get access to school lunches. And there's some proposals to do some block granting, which we know just generally doesn't work in this space. So what is critically important right now is that your two Colorado state senators are going to vote against this bill in all likelihood. They still need to hear from you, but who really needs to hear from you is going back to the House folks, because the Senate's going to pass a different bill. That'll likely happen by July, and then they're going to send that back to the House, and there's going to have to be some reconciliation on the reconciliation bill. And so House members need to continually be hearing how disappointed we are in them for passing that bill. Obviously, for those who voted against it, we want to keep supporting them and making sure they have the resources they need to continue to push back on that. It is very likely that we will see something relatively harmful coming out of this Congress that will negatively impact the people we serve, and we will have to spend a lot of time figuring out how to, how to remedy that and what gaps we can fill and what gaps we can't fill. I will also say that just staying engaged over the next year to 18 months is going to be really critically important. We need as many people to turn out and vote next fall as potentially possible because we need to elect folks who care about the people they're serving and not about the impact to their own personal bank accounts.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I do think we'll go ahead and wrap just a little bit early today. If Gabriella, you can put up the slide, we'll tell you a little bit about our upcoming sessions. So for June and July, we are going to go ahead and try something a little different. We're going to do our education series at noon rather than at 5. We want to see how that works in the summer. We know that we get a combination of community members and people who work in the sector, and so we're trying it out. Let us know what you think. You can always email us back. But please join us in June on Wednesday, June 25th at noon for Why Integrated Health is Critical to Solving Homelessness. We're going to really talk more about health at CCH, health for people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness in a way that we maybe don't always have time to dig into when we're sort of running through everything. So please join us for that. As always, thank you so much for attending, for taking the time to come with us. Thank you to Kathy and Andrew, and of course, Aubrey, who isn't with us, and to Shannon and Gabriella on our team, and the whole CCH staff that really makes all this possible. And we will see you again next month.